In the 1980s, there were about 100 criminal gangs operating in Kazan, and it was no coincidence that Radio Voice of America compared the city to Chicago during the Great Depression. This comparison was no exaggeration. Armed men in masks openly roamed the streets of Soviet Tatarstan during the day, shooting at police cars and terrorizing the townspeople. Why did Kazan become a hotbed of street gangsterism? Why did the police not rush to arrest the members of these groups? How many lives were lost in the gang wars of the 1990s, and what has become of the leaders of those groups today? Eyewitnesses helped shed light on this. Sergei Antipov, one of the first leaders of the Kazan gangs, Alexander Avakomov, a former criminal investigation officer, and Robert Gareev, author of the book Slovo Patsana, The Word of a Boy. August 1978. A crowd of young men in nylon masks rushes through the streets of Novotatarskaya Sloboda. There are more than 50 of them. The older ones arrived in their own cars with parabellum pistols, sawed-off shotguns, and even grenades. The infantry was brought in by buses and trucks, armed with iron bars and rebar. Soon the first shots rang out. The bandits beat up passers-by and motorcyclists, shot at buses and cars, and set fire to Soyaspeket kiosks in broad daylight. 2 columns of militants entered the settlement. The first ones burst in on motorcycles, raced through the streets, and began smashing cars. It so happened that at that moment there was almost no one on the streets. The local residents did not catch their eye. The young men ran around, firing their sawed-off shotguns into the air, staging a show of madness. When the first police car arrived at the scene, a grenade was thrown at it. Fortunately, it did not explode, but the bandits opened fire. 2 police officers were wounded. One of the attackers was fatally wounded in the shootout. But even the sight of their bleeding comrade did not stop the others. The shooting continued. A pensioner was killed by a stray bullet, and several other passers-by were seriously wounded. It was a miracle that they survived. "What can you expect from idiots?" recalls one of the eyewitnesses. "Idiots can only shoot and yell. I don't know what they were doing there, and I didn't care. It was complete nonsense." Sergei Antipov, who is considered one of the gang's leaders, did not officially participate in the raid. At the time, he was serving a prison sentence. But many believe that without his consent, the young fighters would not have dared to take such a step. Antipov himself categorically rejects these accusations. He agreed to tell his story with great reluctance, on the condition that his face would not be shown. We will return to this story later. For now, let's continue to examine the events of the raid and its consequences. After all, back then, within the walls of the school, children were promised that communism would come to the USSR in the 1980s. Back in the 1960s, Nikita Khrushchev declared from the podium that the coming 1980s would show us the last criminal on television, and many citizens sincerely believed that crime would be finally defeated in the Soviet Union. Raised in the spirit of optimism and a socialist future, people considered such words not just propaganda, but prophecy. It seemed that the system was so strong and controllable that there could be no question of gangs, raids, or bloody showdowns. And then, like a bolt from the blue, in the late 1970s, the investigative authorities in Kazan opened a criminal case against a local youth gang under the article banditry. For the entire republic, and even more so for the city, this sounded like a sensation, because no cases had been opened under Article 77, the article under which banditry was classified, for almost 2 decades. It was believed that such phenomena had been eradicated once and for all in the USSR at the end of the 1950s. Why, then, did the Kazan authorities not limit themselves to the usual formulation of hooliganism in such cases, but decided to call what happened a full-fledged bandit raid? It was not only because of the murder of a pensioner and the shootout with police officers. On that day, a real armed raid took place in Novotaskaya Sloboda. Grenades, shooting at cars, wounded law enforcement officers, and dead bystanders. It all looked like a frontline report, not a normal teenage brawl. The next day, news of the armed gang of Kazan teenagers spread far beyond the borders of the USSR. Radio Voice of America ran a story comparing the capital of Soviet Tatarstan to Chicago during Prohibition and the gang wars. "Listen, listen," they said from New York. "In Kazan, teenagers are behaving like Al Capone's gangs. Moscow could not ignore such a comparison and the resonance it had on the international stage. There were rumors that the top brass had decided to make an example of the gang. Apparently, they were talking about shooting 5 of them. But when it turned out that they were teenagers, the idea of execution seemed too harsh even for the tough Soviet justice system. In the end, the number of those sentenced to death was reduced to 4, and 2 of them were pardoned at the last moment. However, along with them, everyone else was sent to prison. Not only those who participated in the raid, but also guys from other Kazan gangs, and even unnecessary elements in general. In this way, the authorities tried to suppress the phenomenon itself and prevent its recurrence. The events of August 1978 were not a random excess or a tragic coincidence. They were the logical culmination, the result of many years of criminal activity by this gang, which had long held entire districts of the city in fear. Perhaps the first high-profile incident that forced the townspeople to take serious notice of these teenagers was their mass brawl in the very center of Kazan. It happened in Gorky Park, the city's main dance floor, where young people gathered in the evenings to listen to music, dance, and socialize. The atmosphere there was usually light and festive, but on that day, everything turned out differently. The gang members did not arrive secretly or individually, but demonstratively, in 2 buses at once. Many of them had rolled up newspapers in their hands, which looked harmless but concealed reinforcing bars inside. The fight started suddenly and without any reason. There was no domestic quarrel or conflict between the groups. They just started beating everyone up on command. The crowd tried to run away in panic, but the teenagers in the gang had a clear goal: to show their strength, instill fear, and make a statement. Many young people were injured that evening, many seriously. The attackers themselves disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the park as suddenly as they had arrived. None of them were detained at the time. When the police arrived at the scene, it looked like a raid had taken place. Beaten and frightened young people were lying everywhere, along with broken bottles, torn clothes, and blood on the asphalt. But it was impossible to determine who exactly was behind the attack. Formally, there were no witnesses. Everyone was afraid to openly name names. And although the official reports referred to unknown hooligans, everyone in the city knew very well who was behind the attack. It was members of the notorious Taya Plyap gang. And don't be fooled by its seemingly harmless name, which sounds a little childish and funny. In fact, Taya Plyap kept the entire city in fear, controlled entire neighborhoods, and in some areas actually dictated the rules of life. Rumors about them spread by word of mouth, and just mentioning the name could make people fall silent and lower their eyes. It is important to understand that we are not talking about the wild 90s, which in the mass consciousness are associated with racketeering, showdowns, and gangster bosses. No, everything happened in the mid-70s, officially during the period of developed socialism, later called by historians the time of stagnation. By all Soviet standards, it was a time of stability and confidence in the future. Nevertheless, it was then that a group of more than 100 people existed in Kazan. It had a clear structure and was divided into several brigades, each of which was engaged in its own type of crime. Some specialized in theft, others in motorcycle theft, and still others were engaged in so-called assistance, collecting money from retail outlets, markets, and entertainment establishments. In essence, Taya Plyap introduced elements of classic racketeering into Soviet reality. Everyone who had any kind of illegal income or was simply vulnerable had to pay. Butchers at collective farm markets who sold meat on the side, waiters in beer bars who liked to pocket extra change, and many others fell under their control. If anyone refused to pay, the punishment was swift and visible. In bars and cafes, teenagers smashed dishes, broke mugs and bottles, and overturned tables. The Taya Plyapovsi did not get their name by accident. They lived in a neighborhood not far from the Teplo Control Measuring Instrument Factory. The irony of fate was that it was thanks to this factory and its workers' village that the group got its name. Although there was nothing romantic or beautiful about it, the word Taya Plyap quickly became a formidable symbol that caused fear and anxiety among the townspeople. The district itself began to be built up in the 1950s. Standard 5-story buildings were erected, intended primarily for the factory's workers, but other migrants also received apartments. Residents of Kazan's outlying settlements flocked here, including many from Sukhanaya Sloboda, an old criminal district where Fyodor Shaliapin himself spent his childhood in poverty and lawlessness at the beginning of the century. Sukhanka had had a bad reputation for decades. In its slums, where poverty and crime had been intertwined since its foundation, the all-union meeting of thieves-in-law took place in 1957, an event that further cemented the district's criminal aura. It was there, in those cramped, dilapidated houses and dirty streets, that Sergei Antipov, the future leader of Tyapliyap, grew up. His childhood can hardly be called happy. The families living in Sukhanka eked out a miserable existence, without amenities, in cold apartments with stove heating, where they had to chop and carry firewood themselves. Sergei recalled that the responsibilities of an adult fell on his childish shoulders. "There are small photographs of me sawing wood and stoking the stove," he said later. "I also had to fetch water. All of this was my responsibility." Poverty was not just a backdrop, but a constant challenge. When Antipov turned 14, the family finally got an apartment in a new neighborhood near Teplokontrol. For Sergei, it was like moving to another world. He started 7th grade and felt for the first time that life could be different, more comfortable, even if it was in a typical 5-story building. Compared to Sukhanka, it was a completely different civilization, he recalled. For the first time, the house had at least some amenities, paved courtyards, and better-maintained streets. But at the same time, the neighborhood was filled with all kinds of people, including former residents of criminal neighborhoods. The new life did not cancel out old habits. Sergei's father, a frontline soldier who survived the war and suffered a severe concussion, worked as a driver. The war left him not only with physical wounds, but also with a difficult personality. There were frequent quarrels in the family, and Antipov Jr. himself was often the target of brutal beatings. Sergei admitted that he endured this violence for a long time. But at the age of 15, a turning point occurred. Once, when his father started beating him again, Sergei ran out of the house into the street, hoping to get away. But his father ran after him. Then, for the first time, the teenager had a thought. "If I've endured this for so many years, if I've been wrestling and easily escaped from holds, why should I be afraid now?" And, gathering his courage, he struck his father back. "I landed a couple of punches on him, and he fell," Sergei recounted years later. His father tried to attack him several more times, but each time he was met with resistance. While still living in Sukhanka, Sergei Antipov became seriously interested in sports. At first, it was freestyle wrestling. The club was nearby, and for a teenager from a poor neighborhood, it was a real discovery. Sport gave him not only strength but also confidence, a feeling that there was a place in the world where he could prove his worth. A little later, Antipov took up boxing, and it was then that his character began to form that blend of toughness and straightforwardness that would later become the hallmark of the leader of Tyapliyap. In the mid-1960s, when he turned 16, he was already working out, attending training sessions, gaining mass and strength. Sergei admitted that he often had to use his physical strength, and not for the sake of empty hooliganism. According to him, this was due to his heightened sense of justice. If someone bullied the weak, humiliated his friends, or tried to exert authority, he could not just walk by. It was during this period that people began to talk about him on the streets. He was known as a guy who didn't back down and could fight anyone. "When I started boxing, people began to recognize me, and conflicts with the old guys began," Antipov recalled. By old guys, of course, he did not mean people of advanced age. In the street environment, this was the name given to former gang members who had returned after serving in the army or serving their sentences. These people were considered tough and experienced, and they tried to keep the youth under control. But it was with them that 16-year-old Sergei had his first real clashes. He was not afraid of their authority and sometimes even beat up those who tried to put the kid in his place. Antipov's fighting skills could not go unnoticed. His older comrades began to invite him more and more often to so-called showdowns, meetings where disputes between gangs or individual groups were resolved. There, not only fists were valued, but also composure and the ability to remain psychologically strong. Sergei quickly proved that he had both. One incident in particular stuck in his memory and became a turning point. Once, he was invited to a meeting at the Kazan restaurant. Formally, It was to meet a serious boxer who was involved in a group that dealt with business in the city center. Sergei was only 16 at the time. "I came out of the restroom," he said, "and saw a man standing there, about 25 or 30 years old. It was immediately clear that he was waiting for me." Antipov walked past, but the man stopped him, saying the banal phrase, "Give me a cigarette." Sergei replied calmly, "I don't smoke." Then the man, trying to humiliate the teenager, said, "What kind of man are you if you don't smoke?" The words themselves sounded like a common taunt, but Sergei sensed something else in them, a desire to suppress him, to test his strength. He looked him straight in the eye. At that moment, Antipov realized for the first time the power of his own gaze. "I realized that he was looking for a reason to pick a fight," he said, "and he realized that he was about to get one. And he broke down. He broke down mentally." It was shocking. A grown man, stronger and more experienced, suddenly faltered before a 16-year-old boy, not from a blow, but from a glance. That day, Antipov felt for the first time how psychological pressure works. Even decades later, Sergei Antipov refuses to admit his involvement in the Kazan gangs. In conversations, he emphasized that he always kept to himself and had nothing to do with Tyaplyak. Moreover, he reacted sharply to any hints that he was allegedly the leader of the gang. To him, it sounded like an attempt to label him, which he categorically disagreed with. "I wanted to provoke him, but he understood that he was about to get beaten up, so he swallowed it all," he said about those conflicts in his youth. But at the same time, he always emphasized that his participation in street fights did not mean leadership or formal membership in any gang. However, many researchers, journalists, and former participants in the events are convinced of the opposite. According to the generally accepted opinion, it was Antipov who became the leader of the courtyard community of the micro-district near the Teplo control plant in 1966. He was older than most of the guys, possessed physical strength, athletic training, and the ability to psychologically pressure people. Combined with his charisma and tough character, all this made him a natural leader. In interviews he gave in his later years, Antipov initially even denied the very existence of Tyaplyak. "What is Tyaplyak? When did it come about? I don't know when it came about. It was called the Tyaplyak factory. And somehow they started to organize themselves there. Nothing started to organize itself there," he said, as if dismissing the topic. But in Kazan itself, it was well known, if there is a stable concept of Tyaplyapovsi, then we are not just talking about neighbors or guys from the same yard, but about something more organized. After all, such nicknames do not arise out of nowhere. It is always a name that stands for power and authority. Even Antipov himself, denying the existence of a group, unwittingly acknowledged the fact of close friendship and solidarity. "We all lived nearby. We were all neighbors. Javda lived in the house next door. We lived in the same courtyard. In fact, living in the same courtyard, it was impossible not to know each other." This is where the figure of Zavdat Kantimirov, known in Kazan by the nickname Javda, appears. He is considered another leader of Tyaplyak. Antipov remembered him with respect and always noted that Javda was not just a neighbor, but a person who was listened to and valued. At the time of the community's inception, Kantimirov was 7 years younger than Sergei, and it was only in the early 1970s that he finally joined the Tyaplavites. But despite his age, Javda quickly gained authority. In the eyes of many, he became the real leader. Antipov, rejecting his leadership, seemed to shift this role to Kantimirov. "The fact that he was the leader after 1974 is clear," Sergei said. But when asked directly, "Leader of whom?" he evaded the question. "Well, I don't know who. Everyone respected him. Everyone." These words reveal a duality. On the one hand, a denial of the very idea of a gang, and on the other, an acknowledgement that there was a force in the area that had a leader. According to eyewitnesses, people in Tyapli still speak well of Zavda. Even decades later, he is remembered as a fair, strong, and influential man. "I still respect him." It is important to understand that Sergei Antipov was considered the first leader of Tyaplyak. But his time at the head of the gang was short-lived. He was soon arrested and sent to prison. After that, the younger generation found itself under the leadership of Zavdat Kantimirov, better known as Javda. It was he who led the guys on that infamous run in 1978, which became the culmination of the gang's history. Formerly, Javda worked as an electrician and was registered at the Kazan Youth Center. But he almost never went to work, while still receiving his salary regularly. His boss turned a blind eye and gave him 8s on his timesheet. However, one day the foreman said he would no longer do this, and after intense pressure from Javda, he was soon forced to resign. Another key figure in Taya Plyap was Sergei Skryabin, nicknamed Skryaba. Some called him the mastermind of the gang, others called him the chief of staff. Many recalled his particular business acumen. According to Antopov's recollections, Skryaba was involved in a wide variety of activities: robberies, divorces, reselling cars, icons, and even morphine ampoules. Antopov himself claimed that he was aware of Skryaba's activities but did not participate in them. One of the typical schemes was the so-called market scam. Young Taya Plyapovites would come to the flea market and see someone selling scarce jeans. The real price at that time could reach 250 rubles, but buyers would deliberately ask the question, "How much does it cost?" If the seller, fearing the police, whispered 25 kopecks to disguise the transaction, they instantly took advantage of this. They tried on the jeans, paid the kopecks, and calmly walked away. When the commotion began and the police intervened, they calmly explained, "We asked the price," he said, 25 kopecks. "We bought them for that amount." Most sellers did not complain in the end. They were afraid to get involved with the Taya Plyapovites, realizing that reporting them to the police would cause them much more trouble than the loss of a pair of jeans. For a long time, the unofficial headquarters of the Taya Plyapovsi was their underground gym, a small sports hall where the guys from the team, or brigade, as they called themselves, spent almost all their free time. Here they did physical training, sparred, worked out on homemade exercise machines, or simply spent their evenings playing cards. Later, sports and a healthy lifestyle would become a characteristic feature of Kazan gangs, and it is believed that Sergei Antopov set the trend for this. However, Antopov himself repeatedly denied that he was the initiator or organizer of the sports movement among the Teplivites. They write that I organized sports. Why would I need that? I went to any gym, and they accepted me everywhere. It was just the guys doing it for their own pleasure, he claimed. When they tried to ask him in more detail about the role he played in the company, he replied evasively, "I had my own life." When asked what he was doing at the time, Antopov replied simply, "I worked as a driver on call at the second motor depot. I really liked the job." And when asked directly, "So you were an authority figure," he explained, "Well, they listened to what I had to say, they were accommodating, they respected me." However, in 1974, his life changed dramatically. Antopov received his first prison sentence, 3.5 years for carrying a cold weapon. This arrest was a turning point. He effectively lost control of the Teplivites, and the group was left without its original leader. Under Antopov, Taya Plyap rarely got into serious conflicts with its neighbors. Moreover, the Teplavka even joined forces with other groups to exert joint influence. But after Sergei's arrest, the situation changed. Without his authority and restraining influence, the guys increasingly attacked even those who had recently been considered allies. Gradually, former partners began to move away from Taya Plyap. The culmination was open hostility with the Novotatarskaya group. It was this conflict that ultimately led to the collapse of the gang. The reason for the ill-fated raid, which went down in Kazan's history in 1978, was a seemingly insignificant domestic conflict between two well-known figures from different groups, Sergei Skryabin, nicknamed Skryaba from Taya Plyap, and Renat Monti, a representative of the Novotatarsky group. According to eyewitness accounts, Skryabin had a particular manner of behaving in fights. He struck sharply, unexpectedly, without warning, as if from behind. In the street environment, this style was considered a sign of weakness and disrespect. That is exactly how Skryaba struck Renat Monti, in front of a crowd of people and, most importantly, in front of a woman. For that time and culture, it was a serious insult that could not be left unanswered. Clashes between the Taya Plyapovsi and the Novotatarsky began almost immediately. However, the story did not end there. After some time, Skryaba managed to persuade Zhovdat Kantimirov, better known as Zhovda, to organize a large demonstration against their rivals. It was he who initiated the very raid that would later be called Kazan-Chicago. The question arises, how did they manage to gather such a large number of participants? After all, we are not talking about just a dozen friends, but an entire army of young people. In fact, it was not only the Teplovka gang that took part in the action. Kultaz joined in, as well as guys from Sukhanaya Sloboda, Pavliukina, Mirny, and even other areas of the city. According to eyewitness accounts, almost the entire population of Kazan gathered in the streets. 50 people, journalists asked former participants. No, much more, they replied. People came from all districts. According to them, it was Zhovda and Skryaba who organized everything. What was their plan? Opinions differ on this point. Some claimed that the plan was primitive, simply to scare their rivals and demonstrate their strength and power. Others believed that street leaders could hardly have come up with such a large-scale operation on their own. It was a stupid plan, it wasn't their plan, said some participants. Personally, I think it was the KGB's plan. The version about the involvement of the Committee for State Security remains one of the most discussed to this day. According to these rumors, the special services allegedly deliberately used the conflict between the two Kazan groups to cause a loud scandal and undermine the authority of the then all-powerful Minister of Internal Affairs Nikolai Shelikov. According to supporters of this version, the initiator was Yuri Andropov himself, who was head of the KGB at the time. Some indirect facts also supported this theory. For example, the fact that Zhovda was allegedly recruited by the KGB at some point. Many sources tend to believe that Zhovdat Kantimirov could have been used in the dark. Perhaps he himself was not fully aware of it, but the KGB somehow had contacts with him. There is no direct evidence of his work as an agent, and most eyewitnesses assure that Zhovda was never a full-fledged agent of the authorities. However, the Chekists certainly had certain connections with the street environment. Another thing is that it is extremely difficult to uncover the whole story. None of the participants in those events openly admit anything, and the documents remain classified to this day. Some researchers suggest that Sergei Antipov himself may have given the go-ahead for the armed raid, albeit indirectly. Another version says that Zhovda simply hid behind the name of a more authoritative comrade. It later became clear that in conversations with his young followers, he referred to Antipov's approval, although in reality this was a lie. In essence, Zhovda used Antipov's authority to strengthen his own position and convince the boys of the correctness of his actions. Why did he choose this tactic? The answer is simple. In the street hierarchy, there has always been a difference in the weight of figures. Antipov was much more respected. His word carried more weight than that of the young Zhovda. Zhovda understood perfectly well that by hiding behind the name of his elder, he would be able to force the others to obey. After all, any group is built on trust and recognition of the leader. But as soon as internal contradictions arise, day after day, week after week, friction inevitably occurs. Ultimately, this leads either to the elimination of the leader himself or to the collapse of his immediate circle. For the investigation, the main thing was not to understand the intricacies of street intrigues, but to show results. The main task of the Kazan authorities was to accuse the leaders of Tyaplyak, and especially Sergei Antipov, of organizing the raid. Antipov and other influential members of the Tyaplov gang had ironclad alibis at the time of the tragic events. Therefore, all charges and primary responsibility fell on Zhovdat Kantimirov. During the investigation, the arrested gang members unanimously named him as their leader. Zhovda himself held out until the end. He did not betray Antipov or other senior leaders, even when he was openly threatened with the death penalty. One of the investigators, Savely Tessis, recalled that at that moment a tear rolled down Kantimirov's cheek, but he did not stop talking. In the end, the court handed down its verdict. Zhovda and 3 other members of Tyaplyak were sentenced to death, and about 30 people received long prison terms. Sergei Antipov was among those convicted. However, the investigation failed to accuse him of banditry. Instead, he was charged with another crime, rape, for which he received 15 years in prison. Antipov claimed that the charge was fabricated. According to him, he did have a relationship with the girl, but it was consensual. However, she was forced to change her testimony. Later, when her acquaintances asked her why she had made such a confession, the girl admitted, "I was presented with a fait accompli. I was in my 5th year at a trade institute. They told me, either we expel you for immoral behavior and give you such a character reference that you won't even be able to get a job as a cleaner, or you sign the protocol." In the end, she was forced to agree to give false testimony. In the detention center, fate brought Antipov and Javda together again. They ended up as cellmates. Javda was already awaiting execution. Recalling those days, Antipov said, "Maybe he asked for something to be passed on to the outside world? No. He didn't ask for anything. Nothing. I asked him once, 'What are you doing?' And he replied, 'I'm learning English.' I couldn't believe my eyes. He never lied. He was an honest guy. And then they started making things up. Gangs, criminals. But in reality, there was no gang in the usual sense of the word. We just lived our strange, incomprehensible lives. It was strange not because we were like that, but because the country itself was strange. Violence took up too much space in this life. It surrounded us from childhood. Violence in the family, violence on the streets, violence from the authorities. It seemed that wherever you looked, there was violence. But the arrests and executions of the leaders of Taya Playap did not solve the problem of juvenile crime. On the contrary, the opposite happened. Antipov, Zavda, and Skriaba became role models for young people. Their path, their audacity, and their fame gave rise to a new wave of street communities. It was on the basis of the Teplivites and their legacy that what researchers would later call the Kazan phenomenon began to take shape. It is important to understand that gangs as a phenomenon were not unique to Kazan. They existed throughout the Soviet Union. Their roots went back to the post-war years. Khrushchev's amnesty also played a role. About 1 million prisoners were released at that time, and not all of them were political. Along with them, the so-called Blatnaya Romantica, criminal romanticism, returned to society, a special criminal culture that quickly penetrated the youth environment. Other factors also influenced the development of street gangs. One of the most important was post-war urbanization. In the 1960s, industry grew rapidly in Kazan, and rural residents moved to the city en masse. Along with them came their way of life, traditions, and habits. One of these traditions was the protection of their territory. In villages, there were fights between villages, and in the city, this habit turned into fights between streets. The new city dwellers, who had moved from slums and villages to a more comfortable urban environment, had not yet mastered the rules of peaceful coexistence. For them, the world was divided simply into us and them. The ideology of street communities was based on a simple principle, us and them. At the same time, local authorities preferred to ignore the growing movement for a long time. Even when they were informed about mass fights and the formation of youth groups with a clearly criminal bent, everything was blamed on the poor work of the Komsomol and the shortcomings of the education system. The Republic did not want to admit that hooligan groups had appeared on its territory, which were gradually turning into real gangs. Such a reputation was undesirable. The official line required demonstrating prosperity and developed socialism. However, by the early 1980s, it became impossible to turn a blind eye. By that time, there were about 100 gangs operating in Kazan, and their influence was felt throughout the city. It was at this time that Alexander Avakumov joined the Criminal Investigation Department, where he served until 1997 and rose to the rank of deputy head of the department. His career coincided with the hottest phase of the so-called Asphalt Wars. The Asphalt Wars referred to the period from the early 1980s to the early 1990s. The gangs were called by different names at the time, Motalkas, later Kontoras, or simply streets. Each of them had its own territory. For the small ones, it was a courtyard or several houses, for the medium ones, entire neighborhoods, and for the large ones, several micro-districts. At first, everything was limited to fights over asphalt. The guys came out in crowds and figured out who was stronger in the area. Over time, the process went further. Leaders began to unite, strengthen their positions, and absorb smaller companies. The groups grew larger, drawing more and more young teenagers into their orbit. Thus, something like a state within a state began to form in the Soviet Republic, a parallel system with its own territory, internal laws, rituals, hierarchy, fashion, and even its own language. In the street environment, words had special meaning. Patsan was not just a guy, but a member of a gang. Prishitsia meant to join the community. Lomitsia meant to run away from a fight or raid. One of the most common rituals of street gangs in Kazan were the so-called actions. Their participants called it mundane, good morning, or good evening. The essence was that the gang knew in advance where and when a representative of the rival street would appear, at school, at a vocational school, or on the way to class. They would meet him with a crowd and beat him up right on the spot, giving him no chance to escape. Such attacks became commonplace. Each group had its own set of weapons. A montazka was a piece of rebar used to strike blows. A kopilka was a hole in the head caused by such a blow. There were even grim jokes among teenagers that everyone has their own kopilka. Over the years, ingenuity in the use of improvised weapons only grew. Metal balls were used, which were thrown at enemies from close range. They shattered the head or face, leaving serious injuries. Later, homemade grenades began to be used. Parts were cut from ordinary siphon cans and assembled into something like a lemon bomb. When detonated, such devices tore off arms and legs, maiming young people and turning street fights into real combat. According to Kazan police, in 1986 alone, almost 2,000 teenage fights were recorded in the city. Patrol cars responded to calls 4 times a day, and these were only the reported cases. Over 3 years, from 1985 to 1988, 15 people died in mass beatings and hundreds were seriously injured. In fact, the streets of Kazan turned into a battlefield, where every courtyard and every school could become the scene of a sudden attack. Alexander Avakumov, who was serving in the Criminal Investigation Department at the time, recalled that the police knew all the leaders and active members of the gangs very well. But even that did not help. There were not enough officers or legal grounds for arrests. Do you think that if they sent a battalion of police here, anything would change? Nothing would change, he said. Even if the police conducted raids and detained a few people, it did not change the situation. They detained 2, 3, at best a dozen. And that was it. The problem was that even though the police knew the names of the gang leaders, they couldn't charge them with anything. Formally, they themselves almost never participated in fights and raids. Everything was done by their subordinates. The leaders only directed, assigned roles, and controlled the organization. As a result, there was no evidence against them. In essence, it was impossible to nip the phenomenon of street gangs in the bud. The most that could be done was to temporarily suspend their activities. But in the 1980s, the police simply did not have the legal basis to combat such a phenomenon. A typical situation: a fight broke out, one street turned against another. Several dozen teenagers clashed, beating, maiming, and sometimes even killing someone. But no one ever filed a complaint. Opponents did not go to the police. It was considered a disgrace, a violation of the unspoken street code. Moreover, the concept of an organized criminal group did not even exist in Soviet criminal law at the time. All these conflicts were officially classified as ordinary hooliganism. But this was no longer a matter of backyard fights, but of an entire system with its own leaders, hierarchy, and rules. For the first time, the central press began to seriously discuss the phenomenon. In 1988, the magazine Ogonyak published an article entitled "Bad Boys." It was its author, Dmitry Lykanov, who first used the expression Kazan phenomenon. It quickly became a symbol of an entire generation of teenage crime. Soon, other publications picked up on the topic. Literaturnia Gazeta, Komsomolskaya Pravda, Sovietsky Sport, as well as the Western press, including the New York Times, wrote about the Kazan gangs. Even the youth program, up to 16 and older, filmed a special report on the difficult teenagers of Tatarstan. Gradually, the term Kazan phenomenon ceased to refer only to Kazan. It spread to other cities and republics of the Soviet Union where similar processes were observed. Street gangs, mass fights, territorial wars. All this became an integral part of life in the late USSR. Even the participants themselves recalled how this image began to work against them. "We were walking, 5 or 6 of us, in baggy pants," said the former boys. Then, already in Moscow, at the exhibition of economic achievements. We hear from behind, "Oh, the Tatars, the Khmeri have arrived." We turn around, "What's going on?" And they say, "Well, they beat us up in Moscow, but you never got beaten up. Why did you come here?" The existence of a phenomenon similar to that in Kazan was practically impossible in Moscow or Leningrad in those years. Why? Because these were centers. They were home to party and state bodies, the leadership of the Central Committee, high-ranking officials, the elite, and law enforcement agencies, which could not allow such a phenomenon to develop openly. Any group would have been quickly nipped in the bud. But Kazan, although considered a large industrially developed city, was still on the periphery of the Soviet system, far from central control. It was this relative remoteness that allowed street gangs here to grow to such proportions. Of course, gangs existed throughout the Soviet Union, some stronger, some less organized, but it was the Kazan gangs that turned out to be the most notorious and visible. This was because the process took on exaggerated forms here, from courtyard fights to a whole parallel world with hundreds of teenagers involved. In the late 1980s, Robert Gareev, a future iconic figure, entered the world. He joined the Nazi gang, which controlled the Moscow district of Kazan, located in a low-lying area, hence the name. His story is particularly telling. A boy from a well-to-do family, where his mother worked at a research institute and his father was a lawyer. Robert was an excellent student, getting straight A's and attending art school at the same time. It would seem that all paths were open to him, an intelligent family, a promising future. But the atmosphere of the city, saturated with gangster novels, left no choice. All the boys knew about the gangs, and at some point, everyone found themselves drawn into the system. Everyone's introduction to the street began differently, but by the age of 10 to 12, everyone in Kazan already knew who controlled which territory. Walking home from school, you knew exactly where Cheniki began, where Kytry Dvor was, a little further on Panilai, around the corner Nizy, and then Gryaz. The district was divided into sections, and each gang strictly controlled its borders. For teenagers, these names sounded like a kind of map of the city, where instead of official streets and squares there were streets in the criminal sense. And every school child in Kazan knew perfectly well. Cross the line and be prepared for a fight or at least a check. When Robert turned 14, 2 guys from a parallel class approached him and offered to join the gang. It was in early September that they were recruiting new members, forming the youngest age group. Within the gang, there was a strict hierarchy of 6 age groups: shells, superiors, youngsters, middle-aged, elders, and old men. At the head of the entire structure was the boss. Until a teenager belonged to a gang, walking the streets was really dangerous. Anyone could be stopped, beaten up, robbed, or simply humiliated. For Robert himself, the situation developed almost naturally. He had just had a conflict. A classmate was trying to extort money from him for no reason. Robert refused, but the pressure was mounting. And it was at this moment that his future friends approached him, offering protection and at the same time testing his willingness to join the street community. In the end, he agreed, and the decision turned out to be logical. For most teenagers, joining a gang was the only way to protect themselves. It was not difficult to accept a newcomer. It was much more difficult to leave later. That same evening, Robert went to a meeting for the first time. According to his recollections, he went there alone and returned home a different person. The issue of extortion resolved itself, and no one demanded money anymore. From that moment on, he became a kid, a full member of the community, obliged to follow its rules and rituals. The main of these rituals were daily meetings. They lasted 2 to 3 hours and were considered mandatory for everyone. They could only be missed for truly valid reasons. There were only 2 such reasons: the death of a mother or problems with the police. Nothing else was accepted. If, for example, only 25 out of 30 people of the same age showed up at the meeting, messengers were immediately sent out. They ran from house to house, dragging the kids out to bring the attendance up to the norm. And if it was still not possible to gather the full complement, sanctions were applied to the entire age group at once. The older members of the groups often carried out so-called checks. If they were in a bad mood, they could approach the younger ones and demand tabachka, asking them to turn out their pockets or show their fingers. In those days, cigarettes were much stronger and more harmful than modern ones, and yellow fingers immediately gave away a smoker. If the check confirmed this, not only the offender himself was punished, but the entire age group to which he belonged. In this way, discipline was maintained. Everyone was responsible for the misdeeds of one. Outside of mandatory meetings and training sessions, time also passed according to unspoken street rules. The guys from the gangs dressed in a certain style that immediately revealed their affiliation with the street environment. Wide pants or tracksuits, fernandelki and voltovki hats, quilted jackets, or fashionable letki jackets. These clothes were part of their image and a kind of uniform code. In groups, they would go out onto the streets and engage in pinching chushpans, a derogatory term for teenagers who did not belong to gangs. Usually, it looked like this. 2 or 3 guys would approach a lone schoolboy, take him around the corner, and take his pocket change or something from his clothes. However, even these raids had a certain ritual. Taking money or items from a pocket yourself was considered humiliating and cowardly, so it was not allowed. The victim had to be forced to turn out their pockets or, for example, jump up and down, then the small change would fall out. It all turned into a kind of ritual of domination, where not only the result was important, but also the process. Branded clothing was considered particularly valuable, especially sportswear from foreign brands such as Adidas. It was impossible to buy them in Soviet stores. People got hold of such items in different ways. Some got them through connections, others brought them back from trips abroad. But most often, the suits were either obtained from street kids or simply taken from Moscow majors. To do this, they would travel to the capital. They would get on the train, wait for the doors to close, and start walking through the carriages. If they noticed a well-dressed guy, they would approach him, take him to the vestibule, threaten him with a knife, and force him to take off his tracksuit. Everything happened quickly and efficiently, without witnesses or unnecessary noise. So-called shakalivany, taking money and belongings from passers-by, was most often the occupation of younger children. They attacked well-dressed kids or random city dwellers, demonstrating their belonging to the street and at the same time obtaining small amounts of money. Older participants were engaged in much more profitable activities. The situation changed dramatically after the introduction of prohibition in 1985, aimed at combating drunkenness. Alcohol production declined, many stores stopped selling alcohol, and a real shortage arose in the country. Kazan gangs quickly found a way to use this to their advantage. They began to engage in the so-called vodka twisting or wine twisting. The scheme was simple. They found empty bottles and labels, diluted the alcohol, bottled it, and passed it off as real vodka or wine. It was on this that many street gangs made their first serious money. In the late 1980s, a new social stratum emerged in the USSR, cooperators or merchants. Private business was just beginning to develop and was in dire need of protection. But the official police treated cooperators as speculators and did not see them as legitimate entrepreneurs. As a result, gangs began to offer them protection. In slang, this was called screwing or nailing the merchant. In fact, it was racketeering. This is how protection began. Street gangs imposed a tribute on those who traded in their territory. The stalls and tents that were just beginning to appear in Kazan became easy prey. Entrepreneurs had few options: either pay up or face harsh measures. Refusal meant that the stall could be destroyed or simply burned down. In the end, people were forced to make a decision: close down or submit. But it was not only competitors or merchants who fell victim to violence. One of the most painful and secretive topics in the history of Kazan gangs was the treatment of girls. This was rarely spoken about openly, but eyewitness accounts show that the street culture of the time was cruel not only to enemies but also to the most vulnerable. Many members of Kazan gangs formerly remained Komsomol members and served in the army, which was considered unacceptable from the point of view of true thieves' traditions. But the street world lived by its own concepts, adapted to the urban environment. A real kid was obliged to respect his elders, carry out their orders, and never leave insults unanswered. At the same time, there was a list of strict prohibitions. A kid was not allowed to engage in commerce, that is, to trade or do business himself. It was only possible to take from a merchant. Similarly, it was considered shameful to work as a waiter, bartender, or taxi driver. It was forbidden to beat up or touch a guy from another gang if he was walking with a girl. Contact with the police was strictly prohibited. However, all these rules only applied within the circle of equals. Outside of it, the main law of the street was, the kid is always right. For example, if you found yourself on the territory of an enemy group and were stopped and asked, "Where are you from?" you had to name your company. You had no right to lie. If it became clear that you were afraid, remained silent, or tried to hide your affiliation, the punishment from your own group was much harsher than from strangers. In Kazan gangs, there was a concept of otchit, to exclude a person from your company. This could be done for various reasons, and the procedure was almost always accompanied by humiliation or beatings. No wonder they used to say on the streets, 1 ruble to get in, 2 to get out. It was easy to join a gang, but extremely difficult to leave it, and sometimes impossible without serious consequences for one's health or reputation. People were expelled for many reasons: for using hard drugs, for not fitting in with their own people in a fight, or even for systematically skipping mandatory meetings. This is exactly what happened to Robert Gureyev. According to his recollections, at some point he became seriously ill, stopped attending meetings, and became absorbed in other interests. Then one day, some guys came straight to his house during a gathering and demanded that he go with them. "Robert, get ready, hurry up to the gathering. If you don't go, the whole age group will get it," they said. On the way, he realized that the situation was strange, and gradually understood that he was not being taken to a regular meeting, but to a beating. "I gathered myself internally," he recalled. "And when one of the main instigators of this beating hit me and spat on me, I realized that I had no choice. The only thing I could do was spit back and hit him so I wouldn't look like a wimp." After that, Robert ran away by a roundabout route. They chased him, but he managed to hide in the swamps, waited out there, and then get out. From that moment on, his life in the gang was effectively over. In 1991, after being kicked out, Gureyev moved to another area, enrolled in university, and gradually moved away from street life. He became interested in music, cinema, and creativity, and a completely different chapter began for him. At the age of 25, Robert moved to Moscow, where he worked for a long time as a music journalist, DJ, tour guide, and called himself a round-the-clock partygoer. Robert was never able to forget Nizy and his gangster past. Years later, he decided to devote a book to it. "I realized that I had a unique experience. I was a member of a gang," he said. "It seems unique only to the rest of Russia, but within Kazan it was an absolutely normal phenomenon. But I thought it was important to study it and approach it sociologically, objectively." Meanwhile, in the 1990s, Kazan gangs underwent a radical transformation. Not just big money, but colossal amounts of money came into their world. Yesterday's kids turned into real gangsters, and the subject of disputes and wars was no longer asphalt, but real economic resources. It was not just about kiosks or cooperatives. Some gangs established control over entire factories and enterprises. For example, one of the structures managed to seize the site of the Orgsyntes factory, which produced polyethylene. At that time, this was a huge amount of money and a strategically important business. The leader of one such gang was Hayter. His group had enormous resources at its disposal. The Common Fund, from which money was used to bribe police officers, lawyers, and other necessary people, amounted to over $1 million. It was a completely different reality. Now the gang's coffers were guarded not by teenagers with iron bars, but by entire armed brigades of professional killers. The mass fights that gangs engaged in during the 1970s and 1980s were a thing of the past. They were replaced by more effective and terrifying methods of warfare. One of the police officers involved in eliminating such gangs recalled, "When we seized their weapons, it turned out that they weren't just pistols. There were dozens of machine guns, rifles, grenades, and even 2 armored personnel carriers." As a result, the level of violence in the city rose to unprecedented levels. According to contemporary accounts, 2 or 3 murders were committed every day in Kazan. In the early 1990s, the staffing situation in Kazan's law enforcement agencies became catastrophic. There was a chronic shortage of personnel in district departments and even in the ministry. Many simply quit, unable to cope with the workload and constant stress. One former criminal investigation officer recalled, "In 1992, I closed about 220 murder cases in a year. And in 1993, it was almost 900. That's when the real collapse began." It's no wonder they say that the sins of the 90s began in 1993. But it wasn't just about the statistics. The nature of the crimes was extremely brutal. What was happening on the streets of Kazan was beyond Hollywood's wildest dreams. Militants from rival gangs acted cynically and brazenly. A woman with a stroller might be sitting at the entrance to a building, and passers-by would think she was just a mother with her child. But the moment a fighter from the opposing group came out of the building and got into a car, the woman would take an automatic weapon out of the stroller and shoot the entire car at point-blank range. This was not an optical illusion, but a well-thought-out disguise. A militant was acting under the guise of a mother. The cruelty knew no bounds. To hide the traces of their crimes, the bodies of the victims were mutilated beyond recognition. Hands were cut off, acid was poured over them, and their faces were burned with a blowtorch to make identification impossible. The violence went far beyond the feuds between the militants themselves. It spread to their family members. In shootouts and assassination attempts, the wives and children of gang leaders were killed, while others were taken hostage. One of the episodes recounted by eyewitnesses is particularly horrific. The wife of one of the gang members recounted that her husband was in Moscow at the time, while she was walking through the city with her daughter. Suddenly, a car pulled up beside them and several men got out. They literally snatched the girl from her mother's arms and said, "Gather the required amount of money, and we'll return her in a few hours." The woman desperately rushed to collect the money, and only by a miracle did she manage to scrape together the required amount. The girl was returned, but the psychological trauma was so severe that the child did not utter a word for a whole year after that. In the 1990s, street life in Kazan finally moved beyond the city limits. Now young boys no longer traveled to Moscow just for sneakers or jeans, as they did in the 1980s. Their older comrades went to the capital and other cities of Russia, not for goods, but for money, connections, and a new market. The Riga market, restaurants, hotels, and large retail outlets became points of attraction. Kazan was becoming cramped, and gangs began to actively explore new territories. Kazan's authorities moved in different directions. Their people appeared in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Sevastopol, Perm, and dozens of other cities. Many regions were effectively taken over. One of the first serious tests was a clash with a Chechen ethnic group in Moscow. The Kazan gang arrived there and immediately got into a conflict over control of a restaurant. Despite fierce resistance, they managed to gain a foothold and then win significant positions for themselves. Gradually, full-fledged Kazan brigades began to emerge in Moscow, and the city itself began to be seen by them as a new platform for expanding their influence. This expansion would later be called a kind of export of the Kazan experience. While in the Republic itself the groups had gone from courtyard fights to armed gangs, they now carried this advanced gangster style to other regions. Raised in harsh street discipline, the Kazan gangs quickly gained authority among other criminal structures in Russia. One of the most famous stories of those years was a clash in the Moscow restaurant Arbat. According to legend, a Kazan authority nicknamed Lisha the Frenchman intervened in the conflict, siding with the Bauman gang in a fight with Chechens. This episode unexpectedly became a point of intersection of interests. The feud quickly turned into a partnership. French established contacts with Moscow gangs and gradually began to bring more and more Kazan residents to the capital. However, his life ended tragically. He was soon killed. This episode, like many other showdowns of the 1990s, became part of criminal legend. Of course, such stories could be the subject of a separate investigation or documentary film. But if we stay within the framework of the Kazan phenomenon, it is important to note that by the end of the 1990s, it had undergone serious changes. First, years of war and internal conflicts between groups inevitably led to a reduction in their numbers. Too many died or ended up behind bars. Second, the state finally responded to the scale of the disaster. The authorities passed a number of new laws aimed at combating organized crime. By the end of the 1990s, the Kazan phenomenon began to gradually fade away. One of the key factors was that by that time, practically everything in the criminal world had already been divided up. Those who had managed to establish themselves and accumulate capital had no intention of sharing, let alone giving up their positions. At this stage, political factors also came into play. Street gangs, which until recently had controlled entire neighborhoods and businesses, now began to interfere with new entrepreneurs and more serious players. As a result, a decision was made at the state level to eliminate street gangs. Law enforcement agencies began to actively strengthen themselves. New personnel arrived in the city, weapons appeared, and special units were created. Gradually, control over protection and the distribution of financial flows passed from the gangsters to the law enforcement agencies. From that moment on, no one needed the protection of street gangs anymore. For young people, the romance of the streets also lost its former significance. Individual groups remained, but the movement was already coasting along, gradually fading away. Today, small gangs can still be found on the outskirts of Kazan, but they do not have the influence they had in the 1970s, 1990s, and they certainly do not control the minds of the city's residents. Meanwhile, the fate of one of the most famous participants in this story, Sergei Antipov, unfolded in its own way. After many years in prison, he was released in November 1992. His release was a real event. So many people gathered to meet Antipov that a whole bus had to be ordered for the occasion. His friends rented an entire hall in a restaurant on Tsvetnoy Boulevard, where they set the tables and threw a lavish party in his honor. The celebrations did not end at the restaurant. Antipov and his closest associates went on to continue the party at a nightclub. There were girls, a sauna, a swimming pool, and all the other trappings of the turbulent post-Soviet life of the early 1990s. "That's how I spent my first day of freedom," Antipov later recalled. Antipov recalled that immediately after his release, just before New Year's Eve, his friends from Pavlyukin came to visit him and invited him to return to Kazan to celebrate the holiday. "Let's go," they said. "It'll be great there, New Year's Eve in Kazan, you'll see everyone, it'll be fun." And he really was going to go, but at the last moment his Moscow acquaintances dissuaded him. "What are you doing?" they said. "Where are you going? You still have your release certificate in your hands. As soon as you arrive in Kazan, they'll lock you up." This argument proved decisive. As a result, Antipov did return to Kazan, but only 6 months after his release. And even then, according to him, he almost got caught in a police raid. The situation reminded him that his name was still well known in his hometown and attracted the attention of law enforcement. Since then, he has become more cautious and has lived most of the time in Moscow, only occasionally visiting his homeland. After leaving prison in the early 1990s, Antipov, like many others, found himself face to face with a new reality. Russia in the 1990s without the criminal world, he wondered. No, there was no such thing. Almost everyone was involved in it. And when asked, who wasn't involved, he replied, well, maybe only you. Otherwise, probably no one else. At the same time, Antipov emphasized that he himself did not join organized criminal groups. Why would I need that, he said. The question of how he made money was inevitable. And he replied evasively, back then, money was literally lying on the streets. You just had to pick it up. This could be interpreted as involvement in protection rackets, but he denied such accusations. What protection rackets? I just helped people, and they helped me. That's all. He liked to reminisce about those he considered true friends. Among them were Rashid Akunov, then Minister of Foreign Economic Relations of Tatarstan, and Eduard Alexeyevich Barbarosh, head of a large jewelry company in Moscow. They welcomed me and supported me, Antipov said. And they were really good people I could always rely on. The people Antipov associated with in Moscow in the 1990s were truly serious and far removed from street crime. They were entrepreneurs, politicians, and cultural figures. But the era itself dictated its own rules. Business and power needed protection and intermediaries who could resolve complex conflicts. Antipov, with his great authority and extensive circle of acquaintances, was a person who was often asked for help. According to his acquaintances, he was not involved in protection and did not participate in the division of spoils, but he could be invited to so-called meetings. There, he acted as an arbitrator in disputes. His word carried weight, and he was the one who could determine who was right and who was wrong. This did not make him part of criminal structures directly, but it showed that Antipov continued to be an important figure, capable of influencing the course of serious conversations. We recorded our interview with Sergei Ivanovich in his spacious apartment in the Moscow suburbs. Today, he is 74 years old. He lives alone but maintains warm relationships with his loved ones and sees them often. Antipov has 4 children from 4 different women. A few years ago, he officially changed his surname, but he continues to post photos on social media, mainly from the 1970s and 1990s, the era when the Kazan phenomenon was taking shape and when his name was known throughout the Republic. "I'm not afraid of anyone," he says. "I'm ready to answer any question, even yours, although, to be honest, I really didn't want to do it." When we asked why he agreed to an interview without showing his face, Antipov explained simply, "Why? So people can point at me on the street? I don't need fame at all." We tried to clarify whether there were any actions in his life that he was ashamed of. "I'm not ashamed of anything at all," he replied, "but I do feel remorse. I went to church and spoke to the priest. He asked, 'Have you done anything you regret?' I said, 'Yes, I have.' He asked again, 'Do you repent?' I replied, 'Yes, I repent.'" Antipov admits that he would never repeat many of the things he did in his youth today. "There were things I did that I don't even want to remember. I'm still ashamed of them," he says. And although his voice sounds confident, these words betray a feeling that former street gang leaders rarely admit to: regret about the past.